Good day, Rhonda here, reading part 4.5 entitled The Consequences, which is part of the Epilogue. This is read from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack, 1993. The Consequences. And by the way, you might hear a cat running around in the background and her bird video. So I apologize for that. Um, I'm fostering cats, and this one's extra special. Okay, the consequences. Q's challenge strikes to the heart of the traditional understanding of Christian origins. Excuse me. Lying at the bedrock of the earliest traditions about Jesus and his first followers, Q documents a Jesus movement that was not Christian. The Jesus movement that produced Q cannot be shunted aside as a group of people who missed the dramatic events portrayed in the narrative Gospels. They cannot be dismissed as those who mistook Jesus, failed to understand his message, or misunderstood their mission to found the church. The reason they cannot be dismissed is because they were there at the beginning. Q reveals what Jesus people thought about Jesus before there was a Christian congregation of the type reflected in the letters of Paul and before the idea of a narrative gospel was even dared. When that thought did occur, it was Q that the authors of the narrative gospels used as a foundation upon which to build their own novel myths of origin. Q is the best record we have for the first 40 years of the Jesus movements. There are other snippets of early tradition about Jesus, but they are all generally agree with the evidence from Q. As remembered by the Jesus people, Jesus was much more like a cynic teacher than either a Christian savior or a Messiah with a program for the reformation of a Second Temple Jewish society and religion. In addition to Q, we have evidence for the early Jesus movements in the pre-Markan pronouncement stories. The pre-Markan miracle story sets, the Gospel of Thomas, and the parables. All of these traditions about Jesus demonstrated a remarkable independence from the congregations of the Christ and provide evidence for a revised history of Christian beginnings that does not agree with the traditional Christian imagination based on the Gospels. As we have seen, the narrative Gospels can be described both as a further development of the Jesus traditions and as a reserved acknowledgement and cautious appropriation of the Christ myth that first emerged in northern Syria and the Pauline churches. The underlying logic of the Christ myth was a martyrology. A martyrology was fastened on for reasons specific to the congregations of the Christ, in which a most unlikely mix of Jesus people was in need of justification or rationalization by means of a myth of origin. How the Christ myth answered the problem has been discussed in chapter 11. Once it was in place for that purpose, the myth of the death and resurrection of Jesus as the Christ was then further embellished as a symbol of a personal transformation and spiritual presence. The genius of the narrative Gospels was their appropriation of the martyrology of the Christ that did not require an acceptance of the cultic implications of the Christ myth. In the light of Q, the congregations of the Christ now have to be explained as emerging from the Jesus movements. The direction of development cannot be the other way around. Q reveals a vigorous movement that was not generated by a belief in Jesus as the Christ, whose death and resurrection dramatically changed the course of history. There is no indication that any of the Jesus movements were interested in salvation by personal spiritual transformation on the model of the Christ event. As for the narrative Gospels, they were composed much later at crossroads in the history of the Jesus movements, where various social and ideological issues of self definition and external challenge influenced the way in which Jesus was reimagined. Despite their appropriation of the Christ martyrology, to compose a passion narrative as the climax for their story of Jesus, the narrative Gospels take their place in the rich history of myth making characteristic of the Jesus movements. Myth making was already far advanced in the Q tradition, as we have seen, and this has been achieved without any recourse to the Christ myth. The narrative Gospels developed that tradition and continued the process of myth making along essentially the same lines. Jesus' importance for the Jesus traditions was that of a founder teacher, not that of the Christ who died and was raised. The fantastic portrayal of Jesus in the narrative Gospels was the result of a layered history of imaginative embellishments of a founder figure, not historical reminiscence, not a meditation on the way in which spiritual life was generated from a crucifixion. Merely readjusting the conventional picture of Christian origins will not suffice to meet Q's challenge. Q's challenge is not a matter of shifting emphasis within the Christian imagination, as if, for instance, it would be better to think of Jesus as more of a teacher than a Messiah. Q's challenge is absolute and critical. It drives a wedge between the story as told in the narrative Gospels and the history they are thought to record. The narrative Gospels can no longer be read as the records of historical events that generated Christianity. Q puts us in touch with the earlier history of the Jesus movements, and their recollections of Jesus are altogether different. The first followers of Jesus did not know about or imagine any of the dramatic events upon which the narrative Gospels hinge. These include the baptism of Jesus, his conflict with the Jewish authorities, and their plot to kill him, Jesus' instruction to the disciples, Jesus' transfiguration, march to Jerusalem, Last Supper, trial, and crucifixion as King of the Jews, and finally his resurrection from the dead and the stories of an empty tomb. All of these events must and can be accounted for as myth making in the Jesus movements, with a little help from the martyrology of the Christ in the period after the Roman Jewish War. Thus, the story of Q demonstrates that the narrative Gospels have no claim as historical accounts. The Gospels are imaginative creations whose textual resources and social occasions can be identified. The reasons for their compositions can be explained. They are documents of intellectual labor, normal for people in the process of experimental group formation. Q positions the Gospels as period pieces from the later phases of the Jesus movements, and thus challenges the traditional imagination of Christian origins as portrayed in the narrative Gospels. The question now is whether the discovery of Q has any chance of making a difference in the way in which Christianity and its gospel are viewed in modern times. The question is quite serious because neither in the university nor among knowledgeable people in our society nor among the Christian churches have the results of biblical scholarship ever made much of a difference. One reason is that critical biblical scholarship is pursued as a classical discipline that generates its own discourse within a narrowly prescribed field of study. But the main reason is that, as we have seen, New Testament scholars have traditionally seen their role as contributing to a theological enterprise, a clarification of Christian origins that supports Christian belief. New Testament scholars still regularly refer to the first church in Jerusalem forming shortly after the resurrection of Jesus as the Christ. That is the reason why the discovery of Q's significance, excuse me, that is the reason why the discovery of Q's significance took so long to be realized, and why the traditional view of Christian origins has prevailed even in scholarly circles. As a result, biblical scholarship has been read mainly by theologians and Christian ministers, not by scholars in the humanistic disciplines, and seldom with interest and understanding by the literate public. Nevertheless, the discovery of Q might be an exception to the rule. Q is hard evidence from the earliest period of Christian beginnings, a new text that has recently come to light, one that tells a different story. And Q can now be read by anyone interested in the question of Christian origins. Historians of religion, dependent on the Gospels and their scholarly interpreters, have always fumbled when trying to understand early Christianity. In comparison with other religions, early Christianity has indeed appeared to be exceptional, a novel persuasion based on a unique and incomparable set of events. So most historians of religion have treated it gingerly or turned instead to study later forms of Christian myth and ritual that bear more resemblance to other ancient and living religions. The discovery of Q makes it possible to have another look at Christian origins, recognize common human strategies in the construction of myths and rituals, and study the process by which an attractive alternative to traditional social identities produced a new religion based on a new social anthropology. We might even learn something about the conditions and processes by which new religions form. Now that early Christianity can serve as another example of such a phenomenon, historians of religion should be delighted with the discovery of Q. The media may also be enlightened insofar as the question of the historical Jesus occasionally surfaces for public discussion. The reason the Jesus question captures attention, of course, is because the figure of Jesus looms so large in American forms of Christianity. The Christian's Jesus is therefore the Jesus that is in everyone's mind, whether Christian by confession or not. Western culture has a long tradition of writers and artists who have found themselves interested in the figure of Jesus. Any contemporary artist, filmmaker, writer, essayist, or sociologist can count on everyone knowing the Jesus of the Gospels and what he represents. Filmmakers, for instance, have retold the Gospel story many times, playing on its fantastic features to create both sensational and sentimental portrayals. A measure of license is accorded the cinema and stage as these portrayals unfold, but scriptwriters can tweak Christian sensibility as well, and when the hue and cry revolves around the question of truth, the standard used for the true picture of Jesus is invariably the narrative Gospels. How could it be otherwise when that is the only history we have had in hand? The embarrassment for critics in such a situation is that the gospel portrait often appears as fantastic as any modern cinematic depiction. A recent article on the Jesus of History by the editors of Time magazine can serve as an example of this problem. The occasion for the article was a public outcry in conservative Christian circles about the movie The Last Temptation of Christ. In response, the editors of Time produced an article on the various views of Jesus held by modern scholars in relation to other views projected throughout the history of Christianity. The startling aspect of the article was not that the editors brought to light a number of different images of the Christ, but that as critics they thought of them as all as variations on a single theme. All of these views were assessed against the standard of the figure portrayed in the narrative Gospels. Among the experts they consulted were historians, biblical scholars, theologians, and clergy. They handled them all on the common par of opinion. The editors of Time magazine simply could not tell the difference among a historian's judgment, a theologian's dogma, and a clergy's pronouncements. They thought the current scholarly portrayal of Jesus as a cynic like sage odd. And so the editors offered their own conclusion, namely that Jesus must have been a robust reformer because that fit most easily with the gospel accounts. Critics will now have to be more cautious, and they will have to be more knowledgeable about the question of the historical Jesus and early Christianity. The discovery of Q effectively challenges the privilege granted the narrative gospels as depictions of the historical Jesus. Excuse me. The difference between the narrative gospels and modern retellings of the story can no longer lie in the distinction between history and fiction. The narrative gospels are also products of mythic imagination. The difference lies in the status of the Gospels as foundation stories for religion, in distinction from interpretations of that story in genres of a surrounding secular culture. So the modern critic who seeks to understand a public outcry over Jesus is now confronted not only with the question of modern myth and ancient history, but also with the more interesting question of the reasons why the Gospels are so hard for moderns to recognize as a myth. If the media want to do a responsible job when the question of Jesus surfaces as news, they will now have to do much more than getting a bit of history straight. The Jesus question is really about religion, culture, and contemporary social institutions. Critics will have to consider whether they are able and willing to engage in social and cultural critique. For Christians, the challenge is even more serious. That is because the Gospels have functioned for the Christian imagination not only as a faithful account of Christian origins, but as a Mandela like cluster of symbols for Christian meditation. This narrative collage has been the Christian's window that opens the world of divine intention, the Christian's mirror used to reflect upon their patterns of Christian piety, and the lens through which Christians look upon the world. For each of these symbolic functions, understanding the sense of the narrative is very important, namely that the depicted events happened in human history. The result has been the creation of a Christian mentality that finds meaning in only certain kinds of events. Events capable of Christian nuance are therefore given privilege as the Christian evaluates any period of social history. Q challenges the authority Christians assume when making judgments about their world. Christians seldom assess their world by making a direct comparison with the gospel story. Instead, as with all cultures and their myths, coded formulations reduce the mythic mode to attitudes, gestures, and cliches for negotiating the everyday world. A partial list of adjectives that express Christian mentality can illustrate the point. Christians grant privilege to personal performances and events that are unique, dramatic, original, charismatic, miraculous, radical, transformational, and apocalyptic. All else is often considered banal by the comparison. The daily round, repetitious labor, customary chit chat, negotiations, compromises, folk wisdom, and ordinary humor all fall to create sensations. What counts as significant are crises, breakthroughs, victories, and transformations. With the Gospels in place, one might note the symbols for solving critical problems are a vicarious crucifixion at the beginning and an apocalyptic destruction at the end. Both coalesce in a meditation on destructive violence and creative transformation. The Jesus of Q hardly stands a chance of being recognized within this symbolic world. Myths, mentalities, and cultures go together. Myths are celebrated publicly in story and song. Mentalities are nurtured just beneath the surface of social conventions by means of unexpressed agreements. Myths, mentalities, and cultural agreements function at a level of acceptance that might be called sanctioned and therefore restricted from critical thought. Myths are difficult to criticize because mentalities turn them into truths held to be self evident, and the analysis of such cultural assumptions is seldom heard as good news. Christian myth and Western culture go together. This is true whether we imagine a long, continuous history of Christian influence on Western forms of art, literature, thought, and politics, or whether we imagine a series of missions to expand the borders of Western Christian empires. For example, one might call to mind the spread of early Christianity, the Crusades, the Age of Discovery, colonial expansion through the 18th and 19th centuries, and the envelopment of the world in modern times by Western armies, ideologies, and corporations. In every case, Christianity and empire have taken possession of the territory hand in hand. Christian missionaries have gone along to bless the conquests and spread the good news. Since we have never questioned whether the sense of mission comes from, since we have never questioned where this sense of mission come from, we have never been quite sure of the reasons for all of these expansions and who should get the credit for them, the kings and commanders, the spirit of Western culture, or the church. The Christian gospel and American culture also go together, except that in this case the pairing is harder for us to see. One reason it is harder to see is that Americans have frequently felt uncomfortable with the very notion of a culture. We prefer to think of ourselves as a democracy dedicated to the pursuit of individual freedoms, not not a social system that governs on the basis of a set of shared values. Another reason for not wanting to recognize the Christian influence in American culture is that we are dedicated to the principle of the separation of church and state. We pride ourselves on being tolerant of all religious persuasions, with, with the result that religious persuasion is understood by us to be a matter of personal preference and opinion, not a factor that makes a difference in the way we negotiate our lives together. Religious persuasions are not to be subjected to embarrassing questions. They are never to be seen as the reason why people act the way they do, or as the basis for our society's values, motivations, and prejudices. A third reason for resisting the comparison of American culture with Christian mythology is that if pressed to recognize a set of common values, we prefer to talk instead about the American dream. The American dream is an acceptable way to acknowledge our ideals of progress, privacy, free enterprise, and expansion. To acknowledge publicly that our dream may owe something to the legacy of Western Christian culture is, on the other hand, taboo. The exception to this general rule occurs, interestingly enough, when pressure on public policy and patriotism results in exaggerated expressions of those values for which our nation stands. We have a history of such platitudes: New world, new land, new people, righteous nation, manifest destiny, city set on a hill, liberty enlightening the world, a beacon for the homeless, one nation under God, moral majority, defenders of the free world, and new world order. These truisms signal a messianic mentality. When times are not perceived to be critical, it is easy to discount these expressions as harmless formulations of a well meaning people. Then we are willing to recognize the influence of Christian symbols on our self understanding. But in periods of critical decision, when the rhetoric is used by our leaders in support of some national interest, few find it easy to blow the whistle and ask for debate on the reasonableness of attitudes rooted in religious convictions. Why? Is it because we do not dare, or because we do not know how to criticize our myths? Christian mythology is not the only source of the distinctive set of attitudes that make up American culture. And yet, even though the Christian legacy of the Western cultural and religious traditions has been greatly modified by the social histories we have experienced, Christian mentality in its secular dress is certainly one of the more important ingredients in the magical mix of American self definition. Many scholars in the burgeoning field of American studies and many intellectuals currently engaged in American cultural critique have made this observation. The question is whether anyone more, ooh, right, having a little speaking problem here this morning. The question is whether anything more can be said. Social issues within the American context have raised questions about the many ways in which identities, loyalties, and motivations are generated in subcultural groups or classes. We know that there are many factors in human association, collective recognition, and social behavior. These include gender, ethnicity, social position, economic status, national loyalty, cultural tradition, religion, ideology, and lifestyle. What we do not know or talk about is the mythic equation, how these factors are rooted in mythologies, how myths surface to inform new patterns of motivation and association, how they impinge upon the creation of new mythologies, and how a mythology works in return to inform and support a particular social configuration. We do not know how to talk about the mentalities that underlie a cultural system of meanings, values, and attitudes. Some cultural critics are saying that it is time we set to work at cracking that equation. I also think that the time is right. Americans have lost their sense of our nation's innocence, though the rhetoric of the righteous nation continues to be heard from our leaders. The recent history of what we have done with our technology and power throughout the world is troubling, as are the human cries for help from around a world grown small and yet too large to handle. The list of concerns has run off the page, and we seem to be overloaded with unsolvable problems and unanswerable questions about social and cultural conflict, ethnic strife, and ecological responsibility. For thoughtful people, the issues have to do with assessing the chances for constructing sane and safe societies in a multicultural world while understanding the conditions for predation and prejudice, power abuse, and violence. In either case, it is irresponsible not to engage in public discussion of our own system of cultural values. Excuse me. Social historians, historians of religion, and cultural anthropologists have provided us with an immense accumulation of knowledge about the many skills humans have for constructing societies and developing richly nuanced cultures to inculcate rewarding patterns of behavior. This knowledge can be used as data as we engage in the analysis of our own culture and ask what makes our society pulse. But in order to get to the heart of the matter, we need to break the taboo against talking about our myths. Cultural critique without exposing the myths that support the truths held to be self evident is merely interesting, not telling. Recognizing myths without being able to compare one with another might be titillating, but hardly worthwhile. In order to understand ourselves and register reasons for our social options, culture analysis will have to include a comparative evaluation of mythologies. And that means having a close look at our own mythology. Q should help with this analysis by breaking the taboo that now grants privilege to the Christian myth. That is because the story of Q gives us an account of Christian origins that is not dependent upon the narrative gospels. That is a great advantage. Christian mythology can now be placed among the many mythologies and ideologies of the religions and cultures of the world. The Christian myth can be studied as any other myth is studied. It can be evaluated for its proposal of ways to solve social problems, construct sane societies, and symbolize human values. The gospel can be discussed as an enculturating mythology, and the question of its influence in American culture can be pursued without the constant interruption of questions and claims about the historical truth of unique events. Some may find such a conversation difficult, but others may well find it exhilarating to accept Q's challenge. Q enters the area of public discourse at a time when all Christians are engaged in a turbulent quest to redefine commitments and rearrange traditional values. Christians are actively engaged in sorting through the rich archives of myths, teachings, and attitudes that have defined their religion, trying to locate the symbols that may constructively address the problems of our time. The quest is turbulent because the world has come alive with problems for which traditional cliches no longer work. Christians have been known for their global visions and their concern for other peoples. They have also been known for taking a critical stance, often called prophetic, over against political and social systems seen as unjust and oppressive. Christians do this best while standing within some Christian community, but Christians enjoy this privilege because Christian communities do not have to produce a fully fledged working society. The church, as a social institution, has only to produce other Christians and inculcate Christian ideals. So Christians invariably end up living in two social worlds: the community of Christian values and the workaday world of the society in which they actually live. In our time, Christians of all persuasions have been forced to think about the tensions created by this strange division of identities and loyalties. Reactions range from the political action committees of the moral majority and their attempt to make society conform to Christian standards, to retreat into therapeutic enclaves and or washing of one's hands characteristic of privat, privatistic and apocalyptic views of personal salvation. Neither extreme commends itself to Christians caught in the middle, who worry about the effective difference they have had hoped Christianity might make in the world. Excuse me. So the times are troubled for thinking Christians who wonder about the social and political consequences of Christian mythology and its secular dress. The effect of Christian mythology has not always been humanizing. The Captain America Complex, a book by Robert Jewett, 1973, has traced our zealous nationalism to its biblical roots. Others have reflected deeply on the Christian persuasions that have undergirded colonial imperialism. The taking of the West, the Indian Wars, and the slave trade. Still others have studied the relationship of the gospel story to the profile of the American hero, the American dream, and the destructive politics of righteousness wherever we have intervened in the affairs of peoples around the world. The conclusion seems to be that the Christian gospel, focusing as it does on crucifixion as the guarantee for apocalyptic salvation, has somehow given its blessing to patterns of personal and political behavior that often had disastrous consequences. Two major issues have surfaced for those concerned about the effective difference Christianity might make in a world where nations and cultures are struggling to find ways to work together. One is the long-standing practice of Christian mission with its implicit claim to know what is best for other people. This claim came about at a very early time in Christian history when the ideal of an inclusive community, open to any and all people, turned into a mandate to convert the world exclusively to Christianity. Christians are now in the process of vociferous debate about the need to continue such a persuasion. It is certainly time to reconsider. The other major issue for traditional Christian mentality has to do with problems concerning the use and abuse of power. Everyone knows that the exercise of power is part and parcel of the human enterprise. Critique is regularly leveled at those who have power by those who seek empowerment. But we have not been able to imagine a social system capable of adequate constraints on the abuse of power, much less a society in which the exercise of power is rewarded for its programs in support of human well being. Unfortunately, the Christian gospel does not seem to help, generating as it has the messianic vision of a powerful superhero to right the world's wrongs. With such a hero in mind, it is difficult to think clearly about issues of power and the need for constraints when the use of power gets out of hand. We are horrified, to be sure, by the many strong men who have slaughtered the innocents in our time. But as for the alternative, we still delight in the image of the Lone Ranger with his silver bullet. This thinly veiled Christ figure who brings salvation from elsewhere to a society incapable of solving its own problems is not a helpful image to have in mind when selecting our presidents, for analyzing social systems that empower some and victimize others, or for trying to think clearly about better ways to structure our societies. Q should help, not in the sense of providing ready made answers or highlighting the essential teachings of Christianity, for this would overlook Q's challenge to the Christian penchant for locating authority in the world, words and deeds of an incomparable person at the beginning of Christian history. Instead, Q shows us that the notion of a pure origin is mythic and that the process of endowing Jesus with superlative wisdom and divinity was and is a mode of myth making. Q shifts the focus of conversation about Christian origins away from fascination with the many myths condensed in the New Testament and onto the people who produced them. Q lets us catch sight of real people struggling with a social vision. They were sustained in their efforts to actualize their vision by a small selection of aphorisms, maxims, and images garnered from a profuse field of thought, lore, and mythology swirling around them in the many cultures of the time. At first, that might seem strange to us, as if these people achieved so much when they had so little with which to work. And yet, on second thought, that is the way most people live, making sense of their lives by drawing upon a limited number of truths and symbols. A few proverbs, maxims, and memorable figures can offer guidance even in the midst of confusing times. The people of Q coined a few injections that still work as golden rules for many Christians. Love your enemies and turn the other cheek. But the story of Q tells us more. It reminds us that golden rules are effective not because of some external authority, but by virtue of the agreements a community reaches in choosing to be guided by them. The agreements are reached in the process of living together and struggling with a social vision. The voice of authority from the distant past is a mythic mode of ratifying the agreements of a present community and its recent past in the hopes of inculcating a next generation in the society's image and ethos. The tenets that guide modern Christians, including the golden rules from Q, are selections made from rich reservoirs of Christian wisdom and the American cultural heritage. They are only facets cut on dense and convoluted symbols that have been turned many times, like objects in the hand, until a people catch a reflection of themselves that illuminates their situation. Q tells us that it has always been so. Q's story shows us that it was no different for any of the other Jesus movements, Christ congregations, or Christian churches at the beginning of the Christian tradition. Each took what they had in hand and coined new myths for new circumstances in the interest of compelling social visions. The people of Q did it. The Pauline churches did it. Jewish Christians did it. And so did the bishops, the church councils, Augustine, the medieval churches, Aquinas, and the reformers, as well as every generation since those times. In every case, Christianity has been redefined by social forces, and rethinking that changed the picture, not only of the Christ, but also of the church and its world. It has not been different for any other people. Q's challenge to Christians is therefore an invitation to join the human race, to see ourselves with our myths on our hands and myth making as our task. The question before us is what the Christian religion might have to offer as we rethink how to live in a multicultural world. Who knows? If Christians acknowledge their gospel as myth, others might find it possible to talk with us about it. And we Christians might even find it possible to make some contribution to the urgent task of cultural critique, where it seems to matter most. Understanding the social consequences of Christian mythology. So goodbye, Q. You might be taken up by many different hands. Do take care. You are no longer as strong and as illustrious a text as once you were. Christians may think you embarrassing, and critics may find you trite. So much has changed since first you were read, but my, what a difference you could make if read anew and seriously questioned. Who knows? The story of things lost and found may never sound the same. Godspeed. So ends my reading of the book, The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Good day, and I wish you well.